Hi, and welcome to our latest webinar. The topic of today's webinar is PMDA validation rules and what you can do to prepare for your next submission to the Japanese regulatory agency. My name is Max Kaneski. I'm the founder of OpenCDISC and the CEO of Pinnacle 21. I'll be your presenter today. I have spent a significant amount of time over the last few years working with both regulatory agencies, FDA and PMDA, to implement the validation technology that allows them to scan all incoming submissions for compliance with the standards. And I also advise the FDA Jumpstart service. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please notice there's a button at the left top corner. Just go ahead and ask questions throughout the webinar. I'm going to stop with about 15 minutes left and answer as many of them as possible. Those questions that I won't be able to answer, we'll consolidate them and we'll post them on our blog, along with the slides from today's presentation, as well as we'll put up the video, the recording of this presentation on YouTube. All of that will be available sometime around next week. Before I begin, quick disclaimer. The content of this presentation is my personal views and opinions. It doesn't represent the official position of the Japanese or the FDA regulatory agency. So for today, the topics that we want to cover, we'll start with a quick reminder of the rebranding that occurred a couple of weeks ago. We'll discuss the new PMDA guidances and the recently published validation rules. We'll spend a good amount of time looking at the structure and the content of these rules, how these rules compare to the rules that were published by FDA about a year ago. I'll show you how you can use the Pinnacle tool to validate and prepare your data for PMDA submission, and I'll close out with some recommendations. So the thing is that if you have been following us for the last couple of weeks, you probably saw announcements that OpenCDISC has rebranded. Effective November 9th, OpenCDISC is now called Pinnacle 21. The OpenCDISC community is now called Pinnacle 21 Community, and OpenCDISC Enterprise is now Pinnacle Enterprise. The name change has happened based on a request by CDISC, and it's effective November 9th. Besides the name, absolutely nothing is changing. You'll still have the same tools, same business model. It's still open source, and it's still freely available. The only thing that changes is the name. The only other thing that will have some impact is sometime in the late spring, we're going to be migrating the content from OpenCDISC.org under Pinnacle 21. But we'll have a separate webinar that will show you where all the content is going to be moved to. But hopefully with having one consolidated site, it will make it easier to find everything in one central location. Brief mention of a couple of recent releases that you need to know about. So the PMDA validation support for the rules have been added in Community 2.10, which was released just this Monday. And OpenCDISC and Pinnacle Enterprise version 3, that has been released on November 2nd, that also added support for PMDA validation rules. And if you're not aware, the community version is the open source version. That's the one that's the desktop toolkit that's great for programmers to QC their deliverables, while the enterprise version is a centralized software as a service platform that's used by larger teams to collaborate in submission prep, standards management, and continuous compliance. Both agencies do use the enterprise version of the product. So if you want to be able to validate against PMDA validation rules, make sure you have one of these releases, either Community 2.1 or Enterprise 3.0. The PMDA guidances have been published in a very nice single convenient location This is the PMDA webpage that has organized all of the relevant information. You'll notice the URL at the top. There's a number of documents that are very important for anyone who's preparing for PMDA submission to go through and understand. The first one is the basic principles on electronic submission of study data for new drug applications. This is basically the guidance that started all. This is the one that was released back in 2014 and laid out PMDA's plan for receiving standardized electronic submissions. They followed up in April this year with notification on practical operations of electronic study data submissions. There was another document that added additional information, additional details about the process. And finally, the three documents that you're probably going to be very familiar with because FDA publishes the same three documents is the technical conformance guide, the data standards catalog, and the study data validation rules. These documents are different from the ones that FDA is publishing, but their purpose is the same. So it's good that PMDA has followed sort of FDA's conventions, so it makes it a lot easier for us to find information that we know that both agencies are publishing documents in the same way. I'll provide a separate slide later on with all the links to all these documents. You'll have that for your reference once we get the slides. So what does these guidances say about validation requirements? So I pulled out this language from the notification on practical operations of electronic study data submissions document. Basically what it says is that PMDA will perform validation on all submitted data that is submitted in electronic standardized format. They'll do that using the OpenCDISC Enterprise tool, which is now called Pinnacle 21 Enterprise. They also ask sponsors to confirm in advance the conformity degree of the data, which means that they're asking you to pre-validate the data before submission. And the way you do this is by referring to the published rules. And whatever issues you're not able to fix, you have to explain in the data guide. So this is very similar to what FDA has been asking. So most of you will find this process very familiar. So the first release of the PMDA official validation rules were published just a couple of weeks ago on November 24th. This list of rules is based on the latest rules from the OpenCDISC project, which we now call Pinnacle 21. So this is the version 2.1 release that I mentioned and the 3.0 release that I mentioned earlier. So they based their rules on the latest, which means they're up to date. There's a lot of synergy between the two sets of rules. PMDA did go through and they did change a lot of severities, messages, and some descriptions. And they also introduced some additional rules. So we'll go through the changes in the next few slides. So before we go through the changes, let's talk about the standards that are actually covered by these validation rules. So if you look at the data standards catalog that PMDA published, they accept SDTM version 3.12, 3.13, and 3.2. They also accept 3.12 Amendment 1, but for the purposes of validation, Amendment 1 is considered 3.13. So keep that in mind. If you have 3.12 Amendment 1, use 3.13 configuration to validate it. They also accept Atom version 1, and they also accept Define, both versions 1 and versions 2. So every standard that they accept currently as part of the data standards guide, they have published the rules for every one of those standards and standard versions. So they have 100% coverage. So what does this document look like? I'm going to show it to you in a second, but it's an Excel file, very similar to the way FDA has published their rules. It's fairly easy to use. It's machine readable. You can easily convert it to a XPT file if you like. And it has very similar columns. It has a rule ID, message, description, a list of domains that each rule applies to, a PMD severity, the standard that it applies to in the case where you have multiple versions, so standard versions, I guess, And they have a column called PMDA notes. This is an important column. It has some additional information, some additional business rules that apply to particular rules that you have to pay special attention to. So one of the biggest differences, and I'm going to show you in a second. So this is the actual screenshot from the SDTM rules. The first thing you notice is in column 1, rule ID. You're going to notice that these rule IDs are the same IDs that are used by Pinnacle or by OpenCDISC in the past. FDA has decided to use their own IDs, which ended up being fairly confusing to a lot of our users. So PMDA decided to stick with the OpenCDISC IDs. So that's good news because less set of IDs that you guys are going to have to memorize. So it also will be very easy to link, to the work you have guys done in the past, and you should find all of these rules very familiar. We'll talk about the PMDA notes in the next few slides, but you can see there's a significant amount of additional information that is going to be very useful to understand particular rules and how they apply and when. So I would say the biggest change between FDA and PMDA rules is how they treat severities. FDA has only 2 severities, error and warning. PMDA has introduced a new severity called reject, and they call it the rejection criteria. So what does this mean? This means that if you have any rule of type reject, if it fails, your review will be automatically suspended until corrections have been made. So what's going to happen is if you submit data in one of these rules fails, it will be rejected right at the gateway, and you would have to basically fix and resubmit the data until it finally passes the criteria. So this is fairly new. FDA doesn't do anything like this at the moment. So we'll definitely look very closely at the reject rules to see what that all means. They also treat the errors in the wording slightly different from FDA. If you notice, the errors are something that they say that you have to explain. If this is another cause for the review to be suspended. Currently, FDA doesn't really suspend review if you're missing explanations, but PMDA will. So if you have your reviewer guide, every single error that is produced has to be explained. If not, your review could get suspended. So this is definitely more strict than what FDA currently has available. On the other hand, warnings, PMDA says that warnings are not necessary require an explanation. So this is where FDA requires an explanation for everything. For PMDA, warnings does not require explanation. So on the one hand, it's more strict. On the other hand, it's less strict. But definitely get familiar with the severities. This is a big change. So let's take a look at the rejects. Everybody asks me about the rejects. Everybody is concerned about their submissions and being rejected. The good news is that the rejection criteria today is very, very small. So if you look at the different standards, there's only 9 rejection rules in SDTM. There's 12 rejection rules in ATOM and 13 in Define-XML. So it's a very small number of rules currently. So let's take a look at each standard in the rules and to give you an idea of what would cause your submission to be rejected. So if you look at this list, you see a lot of very sort of common sense rules that should never fail. For example, SD002 or SD056, the SDTM required variable not found, or no value in variable marked as required. Or SD0064, subject not present in demographics, or missing demographic data set, as well as using variables that are either prohibited or reserved for send. So this is very common sense rules. These rules have existed for years. Many of these existed for years, so most sponsors that I see usually do not fail these rules. If you still do, then this is definitely something you guys need to address ASAP. The next list is for ATOM. ATOM list is also very straightforward. The thing that will prevent them from reviewing your submission is if you're missing an ADSL data set. I think that's a pretty common sense one. You can't really, Atom is not really Atom without ADSL. And it has a lot of these very basic flag variables that have a very narrow list of values that you can use. So this is kind of a control terminology rule. So this is all very simple rules. Most companies should not be having any of these problems today. Define-XML is a little bit different. I think Define-XML is still a huge problem in the industry. A lot of companies are still having problems complying with Define-XML rules. So this probably will cause some problems for some companies. There's a lot of, for example, obviously any kind of schema validation issues that would cause your rejection. If you're missing required attributes or elements in the Define.xml, so it's structural issues, you're going to get a rejection. You have to make sure you have the right standard name and standard version because this is used in to automate processes at both agencies. So, if you put in that you're using SDTM 310, which I actually saw a couple of companies do, that's going to get rejected because there's no such thing as 310 SDTM. Or if it is, I don't remember. It was prior to my days in CDISC. So it's very important to get the basic structure and the basic metadata correct in order to enable the automated processes that happen at both agencies. So I definitely would take a closer look to make sure that you guys are not currently violating these. So a couple of the rules that you probably noticed, like for example, the CT 2001, which is a rule that says that if you have a non-extensible code list and you extended that would fire. So some people would say, well, how could that be rejection? I have legacy studies and, maybe I have action taken that I use that I can't map to the standard action taken. What should I do? Well, currently, there's an exception. If you see on this slide, this is a list of non-extensible code lists that would currently cause rejection. It's a much smaller list than the total list of non-extensible code lists. Most of these are very straightforward. Yes, no, sex, age, unit, country. Nobody should be extending these code lists. So the ones that you still do because of legacy studies or because of still sort of process issues, those are still allowed. You would obviously have to explain them because they would be errors instead of rejections. Very similar exception for CQ 2004. This is also a non-extensible code list rule, except it's looking at the value level code list in trial summary and on other places. But the three places that would cause a rejection, all three would be in trial summary, and there's three different parameter CDs that if you have an incorrect code list, those would cause a rejection. Once again, these are very, very basic code lists that should not be extended. And finally, SD002, this is a rule that says that you have a required variable, but the value is null. In most cases, basically for almost every required variable, this will cause a rejection. So if you're missing an AED code, that would cause a rejection. But they did leave 4 variables as an exception that you're allowed to leave them null. And those are all in demographics domain. It's the ARM code, ARM, actual ARM code, and actual ARM. So those are the only 4 variables that are required variables that you could still leave null and not get rejected. So those are the 3 exceptions. There's a couple other ones in Atom, I believe, but these are the main ones. If you want to see all of them, you want to look at the PMDA notes column that I mentioned before. That's the one where everything is described when it comes to exceptions. So let's take a look. The best way to explain the PMDA rules is to contrast them and compare them to the rules that were published by FDA. So let's start first by looking at the coverage of the standards. I already mentioned that PMDA have full coverage over all of the standards in their data standards catalog. FDA does not. So FDA has so far only published rules for SDTM 311, 312, 313, as well as SEND 3.0. So they have not published rules for SDTM 3.2 just yet. They're still working on that list. And they haven't published rules for ATOM or the Define. So what does that mean? Does that mean, does FDA accept these standards? Yes, they do. They still accept these standards. They're using the rules that are in Pinnacle Enterprise. They just haven't had the chance yet to review and publish them. So once they do, probably there'll be some changes to severities. There'll be probably some changes to the rules. But today, the best set of rules to use would be the ones that are available in Pinnacle 21. So for comparison purposes, since the only overlap is SDTM rules, I'm going to compare the SDTM rules. So if you look at just the pure number, total SDTM rule, there's 326 in PMDA list, and there's 314 at FDA. So pretty close, right? So it seems like it's a pretty close list. But if you look at the two pie charts below, this shows you the breakdown of that number by severity. And as you can see, there's a significant difference between PMD and FDA on the severities assigned to the rule. So even though PMDA has the 9 rejection rules in SDTM, the number of errors is significantly smaller at 128 versus 201 errors within the FDA list. So even though it's the same rules, for the most part, agencies have assigned different severities. So let's take a look a little deeper. So what I have done here is I have taken those rules and I also broke them down into the 5 data fitness dimensions. So the 5 data fitness dimensions that we commonly use for analysis of data fitness is SDTM compliance, or we call it standards compliance. In this case, it's SDTM compliance. So it's compliance with the SDTM implementation guide. Compliance with terminology. Control terminology means CDISC control terminology, MedDRA, SNOMED, whatever the terminology may be. Regulatory requirements. That would be the additional requirements that are published by both agencies in their technical conformance guide. Metadata rules. That's basically in SDTM, it's just consistency between Define-XML and SDTM. And finally, data quality. Data quality could be anything, start date greater than end date, duplicate records, so anything that deals purely with the content and the quality of that content. So if you look at the breakdown here, you're going to notice that the biggest differences in severity is in the SDTM compliance and in terminology. The other 3 categories are pretty much, when it comes to number of errors, are the same. So what's so special about SDTM compliance and terminology? And there's a simple explanation. FDA has been using CDISC already for a number of years, and they have a lot more experience, and they built a lot more tools that depend on those standards. So because of the dependency, they are more strict on what they would allow as compliant data. So that's same thing with terminology. So that's the explanation. PMD is just starting out, and FDA is sort of ahead as far as implementation of the standards, and that explains the differences in severities. PMDA probably also wants, because a lot of the sponsors in Japan probably will be submitting for the first time, they want to be more lenient in the beginning as sort of a transitional period. So I would expect over time this gap would most likely close as more and more companies submit, and there's more experience and more tools are developed at PMDA that will make the standards they will become much more dependent on the standards. So let's take a look at a few other differences. One difference is how many new rules have been introduced in PMDA. So there's actually 21 new rules that have been introduced. Almost all of them deal with data quality, and you probably saw it in the chart, you saw the quality. The PMDA had more rules. So all 21 of them basically fall into that column for the most part. And some of the examples would be looking for observations that happen after the date and time of end of participation, or treatments that happen before first study treatment date, or happen after last study treatment date. A serious adverse events that haven't been set correctly based on the qualifiers. Negative study days and exposure. So there's many checks like this that are pure data quality checks. And this is actually a sort of a focus for us over the next year. Is as the agencies start using more and more tools where the compliance level has increased, the focus has now shifted to data quality, because you can have completely standard data, but have half of the data set missing particular values that you need for analysis. So data quality and its impact on analysis will be a major focus for both agencies going forward, and this is a group that will grow. But the question is, why does PMDA have these rules and FDA doesn't have it? And it's purely because of timing. PMDA has used the latest set of rules, and FDA rules have been released a year ago. So I'm sure sometime in the near future, FDA will release an updated list of rules that will most likely include all of these rules in their list. So, there's just a timing issue between agencies of how often they release rules that you have to consider. There's also been some rules that were removed from the PMDA list. There was actually just 9 rules that were removed, and all of them had to do with the trial summary parameters that are controlled by the FDA dictionary for substance registration. Since PMDA doesn't use that dictionary, they removed those rules. There's also been some rules that have been redefined or updated in some manner. There's a very short list, but let's go through all of them. The first one is the maximum allowed data set size. So FDA's requirement is that data sets have to be less than 1 gigabyte. PMDA has changed it to 5 gigabytes. So I think it's just the factor of them reevaluating sort of the hardware and the technology they have available to them today, where FDA rule dates back probably 4 or 5 years. So I think it just needs to be refreshed and updated. But I wouldn't be surprised if FDA has increased the number in the near future as well. But currently, there's a difference. FDA is 1 gigabyte, PMDA is 5 gigabytes. And hopefully that will be resolved in the near future. They also made some changes to the FDA. There's a rule that said FDA expected variable not found. PMDA created their own rule called PMDA accepted variable not found. And the difference is that FDA expects element and epoch, while PMDA expects baseline flags and epoch. So there's they have a focus on slightly different variables as far as requiring for their regulatory needs. They also created a new rule for no treatment emergent info for adverse events. The reason they did this is because they wanted to change the description. There were some changes to the description that they wanted that were not compatible with the FDA list, and that's why they created a new rule. But it's the same exact identical rule, just different descriptions. There's also a couple of measure checks, SD008 and SD008C. So the first one is checking whether your value is in the dictionary, and the second one just checks whether you have the values in the incorrect case. So both of those rules are applied to adverse events, clinical events, and medical history if those dictionaries were used there. PMDA decided to limit those to just adverse events. So this is something you might notice that if you're running the PMDA rules, you're only going to see this ever fail in adverse events. But if you run the FDA version of the rules, you might see this fail in clinical events and in medical history. So minor change, but something that you should be aware of. So what is the conclusion by sort of comparing the rules? What is the difference between PMDA and FDA? So in my opinion, except for severity, which there are significant differences, the rules are fairly consistent. It's basically, both set of rules are based on the Pinnacle OpenCDISC list. So these rules in the latest releases have actually been reconciled, so the descriptions and messages are the same wherever it's allowed. And so both agencies use pretty much the same list, except for the severities and except for the timing of the releases. So there's always potentially going to be one agency moving ahead of the other agency because of the timing. But overall, when you're considering compliance with the agencies, it's comforting to know that it's not completely different. You're still working with the same set of rules overall. When it comes to sort of which set of rules are stricter, some people would say, well, PMDA is more strict. They have this reject criteria. And on the surface, it seems that's the case. But because most of the reject criteria is very basic things that most people don't fail, most companies don't have a problem with, we really have to look at the errors. And FDA has a lot more errors than PMDA does, and thus FDA rules are far more strict than PMDA rules. And once I already mentioned, the reason is very simple. FDA has more experience, they have more tools, they want data, they have a higher bar set for quality, or what we call data fitness. This will most likely change over time. This is just the first version for PMDA. This means that the requirements are most likely to change over time, and most likely it will become stricter over time. So keep that in mind that, this is something that will most likely happen. Another piece of information, this is kind of related to this, I just got it, it was published about a week ago, that I thought would be very relevant here. FDA did a presentation about a week ago on sort of common errors in loading data into the clinical trial repository. So the repository they call Janus, or they used to call Janus. So I was completely shocked to find out that, well, I wasn't shocked. I knew this information prior to the release. But when I first found out about this information, I was quite shocked. 77% of all submissions they attempted to load in 2014 and 2015 failed to load on the first try. So it required changes in order to enable the load of those submissions into the clinical trial repository. So clinical trial repository is a central system that FDA is building their modern review process around. So 3/4 of the submissions don't load. It's a humongous problem. So I would not be surprised if FDA starts introducing rejection criteria as well. I think that's going to be the only way to bring that number down and enable sort of the downstream processes to utilize clinical trial repository as well as all the analysis tools that are built on top. So keep this in mind. The current status quo is not good enough. And it will change, especially as we're approaching 2016, December 2016. Once the guidances kick in, FDA has the right to refuse to receive or refuse to file based on poor standards compliance or not meeting the requirements that they set out. And based on the way the submissions come in now, 77%, that's something's going to change over the next year or two. And I think so. I would expect some changes in the rules. I would expect some changes in requirements. So let's jump into the tools and show you what we added to the tools to make it easy for you guys to comply with the latest PMDA rules. So this is version 2.1. It looks just like version 2.0, 2.01, 2.02. If you're using one of the 2.x branches, you would have gotten a notification a couple of days ago saying that you can download the new version. If you're still on 1 point something, then you can go to OpenCDISC.org and download this version. But basically what we did is for every standard, we have added additional configurations. So let's take a look at this DTM first. So if you notice, there's now 7 different configurations for SDTM. If some of them say FDA, some of them say PMDA. So basically, anything that has an FDA designation means this is official FDA rule for this version of the standard. Same thing with PMDA. So we have PMDA 3.12, PMDA 3.13, PMDA 3.2. So what is this thing without any designation? Well, in cases where FDA has not published the rules yet, we provide an alternative. So obviously you have to validate against something, right? This is, to our best knowledge, the closest list to what they will approve in the future. This will change. This is not going to be the official set of rules, but this is the next best thing. In the absence of a published official list of rules for 3.2 from FDA, use this one. I would use this over the PMDA one because this is more aligned with FDA's current requirements regarding the other versions of the standard. So whenever you're using a version of the standard that has both FDA and PMDA, then it's an easy choice. If not, use the one without a designation. That's your next best alternative. Now, ATOM, similar story. We have PMDA published ATOM rules. FDA did not. So you'll have an ATOM spec for PMDA, and you have a sort of the OpenCDISC Pinnacle version of the list. So if you're doing a submission to FDA, use this one. Define-XML, we actually made some changes. We made some drastic changes to Define-XML validation in version 2.1. A lot of things that people really been waiting for, that a lot of people, especially people using 2.0 of Define-XML, are really going to benefit from it. So the first thing we did is to simplify our maintenance. We have combined the Define 1 and 2 version into the same configuration. So the configuration automatically detects which version of the Define-XML you're using and will execute the appropriate check. So you don't have to even select what version. You just specify the Define-XML, and the only decision you have to make is whether you want to run the PMDA rule or the unofficial FDA rules. Okay? So, and then it will go ahead and it will figure out what to validate. So the enhancements that I wanted to mention. So the first thing we added was we actually added the schema, XML schema validation to the front of the process. In the past, we didn't use schema validation. We used the technology called Schematron, which is basically a substitute for XML schema. You can say that. I'm sure people will argue with me about that. But with this release, we have added XML schema. So whatever schema that CDISC publishes, we will validate against this first. And if it passes schema validation, we're going to execute about 105 additional content checks. So it's about twice as many checks as we had in the previous release. So this is a really major upgrade to Define-XML validation, especially for folks using 2.0. And I forgot to mention about ATOM. So ATOM, it's also a significant upgrade. So about 5 months ago, we did a webinar that you can find on our blog about ATOM validation rules. We implemented the ATOM version 1.3 rules that were published by CDISC, but because of the timing, we only were able to get them into the enterprise version at the time. And it took us 5 months, but we finally got that full list implemented for community. So now community has the same list of checks that are implemented in the enterprise for ATOM. So that added about 73 new checks, I believe. So that brings us much closer into compliance with the list that CDISC has published. Let me show you one little thing that you'll find interesting. So I mentioned how there's exceptions, right? There's some rules that in some cases are rejection rules, and in some cases they're errors. So how does that actually work, right? So I'm going to set up and I'm going to run this one file that I have somewhere here. Here we go. So I just created a simple CSV file for demographics just to show you how these rules work now. So let's jump right into issue summary. I'll make this a little bit bigger. So remember I mentioned there was a rule SD002, there was a rejection rule, but it had some exceptions. And in this particular case, I have two variables that are required variables that are null, country and actual ARM code. Well, if you notice, country was not on the list of exceptions, which means that was a reject. While actual ARM code was one of those variables that they gave you an exception on, allowing it to be an error. So this is something new. This is, we call it context-based severity. So, and the context could be variable, data set, there's many different options. So we're expecting that going forward, there'll be more of this because this allows you to fine-tune. So, you know, a given check might be more important in one data set versus another data set. This new functionality allows us to fine-tune that. So this is a sort of a new trend, fine-tuning severities per data set or per variable. This is also a new functionality in the latest release 2.1 and 3.0 for enterprise. So fairly straightforward. Just get the tool, the configs are all there, everything else is unchanged. You should be able to validate PMDA rules, 10 minutes after we're over with this webinar. Let me show you, I also wanted to show you in enterprise a couple of things that we wanted to address that having all these different configurations, having configurations from PMDA, having configurations from FDA, having unofficial rules managed by Pinnacle. What do you do about all this? Which ones do you use? It's starting to get confusing. What happens if next year EMA is going to, decide to receive data and there's going to be an EMA list of rules? So, we are trying to address this for our enterprise clients. In the way we do this is our viewpoint is that if you're going to prepare a submission, you're most likely going to want to submit to multiple agencies. That means that you have to validate against sort of the highest severity, right? You have to lowest common denominator, right? So if there's a rejection rule, you got to treat it as a rejection rule for every agency, right? Because if it's going to work for one agency but not the other agency, that you still have a problem. And that's what enterprise does. By default, it will consolidate all the lists into a single list without, you don't have to do anything. You just assign the standard that your study is using. So let's say it's DTM 313. We automatically consolidate all the rules across all the agencies. Today it's PMDA and FDA. To give you sort of the list that we believe, not we believe, but the actual, consolidated list across the agencies. If you notice for this particular study, there's 291 issues that were actually produced when we validated it, right? Well, I'm able to go ahead and I'm able to have all these different subsets, right? So I have my own company subset that I can define, that allows you kind of fine-tune what issues you want to see at what phase of the project. But the two important ones that I want to show you now is FDA and PMDA. So if I select, so by default, it consolidates all the rules across all the agencies. But if I say, just show me the FDA rules, you're going to notice this number decreased to 283. If I say, show me just the PMDA rules, it dropped to 269. So you can still focus on the issues that are for a specific agency, so you can either work on them all as a consolidated list, or you can focus on one versus the other. So let me show you a couple of things where it really matters. So rejection rules, right? So I believe there was there was a required variable that was missing, and that's a rejection. So the consolidated list says it's rejection because that's the highest severity. But if I go ahead and I say, well, I just want to see the FDA version of this, it just switched back to error. So basically, the system will by default push you to the highest severity unless you decide to drop down a level, and then they will automatically switch it back to the agency specific. And it works the same way for rules that only apply to one agency. Like, for example, we already mentioned 1077, right? This is the FDA expected variables. Well, this is only for FDA. So what happens if I say, no, I just want PMD only? They go away. So this is one thing that in enterprise we try to do, is to help you manage the sort of what is the total level of compliance? What is the single list that I need to work with? And that's something that we have tried to do in enterprise. All right, let's switch back, and there's only one slide before we move into Q&A. Recommendations. So based on our experience, we've been working with the industry for quite a while. We've been working with both regulatory agencies. There's a couple of things that we recommend that you guys do to ensure the best possible results. The first thing is, I can't stress it enough. Always use the latest available validation rules. So if FDA has published or if PMDA has published a set of rules, these are the rules you're supposed to use. You cannot use the rules they published 2 years ago, because the agencies will always use the latest available published rules when they validate your submission. Same applies to the version of the validation tools. If you're still using version 1.4, 1.5 of OpenCDISC, that's not the version that's used by the agencies. Those agencies are now in version 3.0 of Enterprise, which is equivalent to Community 2.1. So use the latest, because that's the only way you're going to guarantee that you're going to get all the messages that they're going to see, especially with PMDA, where they're going to reject you if you're missing an explanation for an error. You do not want to be missing those error explanations. So use the latest version of the rules and the latest version of the tool. The next thing, and I already mentioned it when I'm showing you the enterprise feature, is that you really should think of complying with the highest severity across agencies. Because one is that you'll most likely have to submit data to both agencies. And even if you're not, the requirements will evolve and get more strict over time. So if PMDA requirements are less strict than FDA today, it doesn't mean they're going to be 2 years from now. So I would always aim for the highest level of quality, highest level of compliance, because that's going to be the best way to ensure the smoothest, fastest approval process. Same thing with, this is actually a quote from Amy Malak, who used to be in CBER many years ago. She said, so I remember somebody asked her at a meeting, which issue should I fix and which ones I should not? And her response was very simple. She said, fix all issues that are fixable. So if it's a fixable issue, you have an incorrect label, there's no way to explain it. You got to fix it, right? So anything that's fixable, you have to fix, and everything else you explain in the reviewer guide. So that still applies. I think she said it about 5 years ago. It still applies today. Should be the approach you want to take. And finally, you want to follow what we call continuous compliance process. And basically, all it means is that you have to begin validation early, and you want to validate often. We see a lot of times companies waiting until their data is locked before they do sort of a full-scale validation. Well, if your data is locked already, how are you going to fix it? You can't. You can't even fix mapping issues because your analysis scripts have already been developed on top of your DTM data. So it's really very costly for you to make changes in the end. So you want to start validating before you even start collecting data. You want to start validating the metadata you used for your study specification. And that's what we call continuous compliance. You start early and you validate throughout the process. And most importantly, you capture those explanations at the moment when you actually understand why a particular issue wasn't fixed. Because we see a lot of explanations when we get submissions as the agencies, and most of the explanations, I would say 70% of the explanations are not really, useful, because they would just say things like, "This is a well-known issue. This is a data management issue." I mean, that's not an explanation. That's an excuse. So definitely manage your explanations the same way you manage everything else. It's a key part of the reviewer guide. It's required for PMDA errors. So keep your process as a continuous compliance process, and you'll have much better results. So with that, I'm going to move to Q&A. Oh, before I do, actually, this is the page that I mentioned before. This is the list of links to all the important documents for PMDA. If you're going to submit to PMDA, in 2016, make sure you get familiar with all these documents. Very important. And finally, we do plan to have a lot of webinars this year, especially with the movement of the website, and a lot of things happening with coming up with the 2016 date. We're going to do webinars very frequently. So if you want to make sure that you get involved, follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook. You can also follow us on our blog. We post usually all the slides and links to the videos on the blog. And at least for the next 4 or 5 months, you can also follow us on OpenCDISC.org. So make sure you do that to make sure you know when the next event is happening. So let's move on. Let's move to Q&A. So we have a nice 10 minutes. I'm going to try to answer as many as I can, and whatever I can't, we're going to consolidate them, and then we're going to publish them on the blog. So the first one, does the check ID in Pinnacle 21 community indicate which atom validation rule it is implementing? Are the atom validation checks defined by Pinnacle? They were not part. Okay, this is a good question. So we have this concept of a publisher ID. So, well, I use the PMDA. There's no publisher ID for PMDA. But when you run atom checks, the publisher ID is going to contain the actual atom rule ID. So we do maintain the traceability between the CDISC ID and the RID. So this is how you're going to know whether the check, basically what is the traceability, where does the check come from, and whether this is check that has been in addition to the list that's published by Atom. Now, we have not added any checks to Atom except for a couple of checks that ensure consistency between Define-XML and the data set. So I think the Atom team believes that that's outside of the scope of their list, and that's fine, but for us, in order to execute those rules, we have to add them to the same configuration. So our goal is to stay, because the Atom rules are really a decent list. They did a really great job putting that list together. And in cases like this, we always defer to the CDISC team to lead the rule development efforts. We are just the implementers of the rules and implementers of the technology. So whenever rules are available from CDISC, we always defer to that first. And that's our policy. I mean, we're just trying to do less work. Let's see what else. Next question. There's a question about analysis result metadata, whether PMDA is going to require it. I'm pretty sure that the technical conformance guide talks about analysis result metadata. This is something that they're interested in. Actually, both agencies are very interested in analysis result metadata. We're actually working right now on implementing, adding support for analysis result metadata to the Pinnacle tools. This is one of those high priority items on our roadmap. I don't have any dates yet, but I'll definitely, this is something on the top of our list, and we're going to update the community with our plans early next year. Let's see. Next question. How often do you release new versions of CDISC Validator? Enterprise version gets updated every 3 months. So it's because obviously it has a lot more features than just the validator, so there's a lot of things to release. The community version, we release, our goal is to release every 6 months. We haven't always did that. We're going to try next year to release twice. Like we have our next version is actually planned for the end of spring. So if we can achieve that, we're going to have a couple of releases within that 5-6 month time frame. So our goal is every 6 months and then patches in between. Like so, for example, in 2 weeks there'll be a patch release 2.11 that will address any kind of problems that were reported to us in the last couple of days that we think are critical. A couple of those were kind of nice to fix. So we are definitely going to stay on top and try to release as often as possible. The next question is, does the community version check for reject rules for Define-XML that Crystal shared? Right, so Crystal was the presentation that I mentioned that talked about the 77%. So the question is, a lot of those rules that Crystal mentioned are already part of the list, but they haven't been upgraded to the reject status just yet. So FDA is actually looking in them, and they will make that determination, I don't know when, but I think if I was a betting man, my money is on that list becoming rejection criteria in some near future. Because obviously anything that prevents data from being loaded into the FDA warehouse is a big problem. So when is it going to happen, or how is it going to look like, whether it's going to be rejection or some other form, I have no idea. FDA, I'm sure, will notify us when they come up with a solution. Let's see. In terms of the underlying check, is there any difference between the community and enterprise version? In other words, are there any checks performed in enterprise version that's not in community, and vice versa? So we always get asked this question, and it's important to understand the difference between the platforms, right? So the free version, the community version, is basically designed to give you basic regulatory compliance. So anything that PMDA or FDA or any other regulatory agency will publish as official list of rules, those will be supported by the community version. So that's our goal, is that if FDA publishes or PMDA publishes, you can always use the community version to perform basic validation. That is our commitment, and that's what we're going to do. That's what we have done in the past, and for the most part, and we're going to try to do it in the future. Enterprise allows clients to add a lot of additional checks on top that are not necessarily compliance checks. A good example would be to look for death information that hasn't been put into the system consistently. So you have a patient that had an adverse event that resulted in death, but there was nothing captured in disposition. So that one is a little bit gray area, because in a lot of cases you might end up producing false positives. So what happens is that enterprise introduces some additional reports and checks that look at data quality issues that haven't been published. And that's because they're either something that, we always have this problem. If you publish a check that produces false positives, and 50-60% of the time, a lot of people complain. I don't want to be explaining this check because it fails 60% of the time. So we always have this balancing act of what do you publish and what do you don't publish. So there's a lot of these borderline checks that are still useful for those cases where they actually, trigger important issues. Those are executed in enterprise as either additional checks or additional reports that are not published and they're not available in community. So I guess the short answer is yes, enterprise does a lot more than community. But when it comes to published rules, they're identical. So the rules that the agencies publish, you can execute those with any version. All right. Here's another question. What if the study was completed several years ago, before submission? We used old version of the tools, old version of the rules. What should we do now? So we're submitting a study that was sort of closed 2 years ago. This is a good question. I think that it doesn't hurt rerunning it against the new version of the rules, because what you're going to be really looking for is you're going to be looking for rejection rules. And as you saw, rejection rules are really things that those rules existed since 2008, most of them, 2009. So if you had studied it done 2 years ago, you would have caught that problem 2 years ago anyway. So if you didn't fix it before, it doesn't mean that that gives you a pass. So those rejection rules are really serious rules. It doesn't really matter when your study was created. Those are serious rules. Now, where you might find some sort of, gray area is errors, right? So a PMDA requires errors to be explained. So let's say PMDA added some new rules this year, but two additional rules that are error rules that did not exist 2 years ago, so you didn't have those 2 years ago. So worst case scenario, you're going to run the latest checks of rules, you're going to get additional errors that you need to explain. I think it's still better, because remember, the PMDA or FDA doesn't know what you actually did, right? They have automated processes. I know you put it in the reviewer guide, you say what version you use, but the automated processes don't look at that. Automated processes just grab your data, figure out what standard it is, run it against the latest set of rules. So I think it's beneficial to run those rules, see if there's additional errors that came up, and just explain them in the reviewer guide. Because I'm pretty confident that even though you did your study 2 years ago, your reviewer guide probably wasn't created until a couple of months before submission. So if that's the case, it's just a little bit of extra effort of explaining a few extra issues. So I don't see this as a big problem, and the alternative is much worse, right? Because you'll get an error that's not explained, and then you'll get a delay in your submission. So I would always try to, be cautious, rerun the tool. If there's always a scenario that you're not sure about, contact the agency. Ask them, discuss a particular issue with them. They say this all over the technical performance guide, and even in the description of the severities, that if you're not sure, contact us on a case-by-case basis, and we're going to figure out what to do in each case. So that's always the sort of the backup option. If you're not sure what to do, contact your reviewers. Let's take one more, and I'll wrap it up. And then there's a lot of other questions. I'm definitely going to answer them all and put them up on the wiki. Let me see. I'll pick a good one. All right, this is a simple one, but it's an important one. So if FDA or PMDA change the requirements to reject, what is the advance notice? So what can we expect? I mean, I have a submission in 2 weeks, and they publish a new rule with rejection criteria. What do I do, right? Well, FDA doesn't say anything because they haven't have rejection criteria just yet. But PMDA actually says in the technical performance guide, I believe, they say that they will provide sufficient notice. They don't say how many days, but they will provide notice. So I would assume that there will be some period of time that they will determine that will allow you to, I guess, still run against the old version of the rules and not be sort of penalized for it. That's what I assume will happen, but once again, I don't speak for the agencies, so I would, if you run into a situation like this, talk to them, and I'm sure they'll clarify it. And just remember, this is all very new, right? PMDA is just going to run pilots until sometime in 2016. They're going to learn a lot from the experience. They're going to see what rejection rules are too bold. Maybe there are some rejection rules that are missing, and I'm pretty sure that there'll be another version of these rules that get revised to fix any of the problems that are found during the pilot. So this is a sort of a continuous improvement process, but the great thing about it is both agencies are very transparent with the industry. The rules are published. We provide an open source tool that everybody could use to validate it. So that's why it makes it very difficult for people to use an excuse that they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the rules. It's all there. It's all wide open. Use it, and I'm sure that the benefits outweigh significance. So with this answer, I'm going to wrap up this session. I would like to thank everyone once again for joining. We're going to take all these questions. We're going to aggregate it with the first session we had this morning. We're going to put it up on the blog. We're also going to put up the slide deck, and we're going to upload the video to YouTube, and we're going to link it from the blog. I would say this is going to be available sometime next week. If you think you need the slides earlier, just send me an email. But we'll get this out there so you can share it with your colleagues who weren't able to attend. Once again, thanks everybody for attending, and looking forward to the next one. Thank you.